If you have ever walked out of a project manager interview replaying every answer in your head, certain you said too much about one thing and far too little about the thing they actually cared about, this is for you. You know the feeling. They asked you to tell them about a project that went wrong, and you froze. Either you picked something so small it sounded like you have never faced real trouble, or you picked something big and ended up sounding like the whole thing was your fault. You could see it on their faces, that tiny flicker of doubt. And you spent the drive home wishing you could have that one answer back. Here is the hard truth that almost nobody tells you. Most project managers do not lose interviews because they lack experience. They lose because they cannot package the experience they already have into a story that lands in 90 seconds. The work is there. The scars are real. The structure is missing. So let us fix that. Over the next 40 minutes or so, I am going to walk you through the 10 questions you are most likely to face in a project manager interview. And I am going to give you a way to answer every single one of them that sounds calm, specific, and senior. Not rehearsed, senior. We are going to use a simple shape for every answer. Situation, challenges, task, action, result, reflections. 6 beats. Say them in that order and you will never ramble again. The situation sets the scene. The challenges raise the stakes. The task makes your responsibility clear. The action shows what you actually did. The result proves it worked. And the reflection, the part most people skip, is the part that makes you sound wise rather than lucky. Keep that shape in your head. Situation, challenges, task, action, result, reflections. We will hang every answer on it. One quick promise before we start. Every example you hear is invented. The names are made up, the companies are described in plain terms, and the numbers are illustrative. The point is not the story. The point is the shape of the story, so you can pour your own real experience into it. Right. Let us begin with the question that quietly separates the people who have only managed small projects from the people who have wrestled a real one. The question about scope creep. Chapter 1. Tell me about a time the scope of a project changed under you. Every project manager has felt this one. The project you agreed to in month 1 is not the project you are delivering by month 4. New requirements crept in. Someone important added just one more thing, and then another, and then another. And before you knew it, the timeline you committed to was quietly impossible. The trap in this answer is to tell a story where you simply said no to every change and held the line like a hero. That sounds disciplined for about 10 seconds, and then it sounds like someone rigid who cannot adapt when the business genuinely needs to. The other trap is the opposite. A story where you absorbed every change to keep people happy, and the project collapsed under its own weight. What the interviewer wants is the middle path. You controlled the change rather than blocking it or drowning in it. Let me show you what good sounds like. Situation. I was leading a project to deliver a new internal tool, with an agreed set of features and a fixed deadline that several teams were depending on. Challenges. About a third of the way in, the requests started arriving. A senior manager wanted an extra feature added. Another team asked for a small change that turned out to be anything but small. Individually, each request sounded reasonable. Together, they would have added months to a timeline that had no months to give. Task. My job was to allow the genuinely valuable changes without letting the project quietly balloon into something we could never deliver on time. Action. I did not say no to everything, and I did not say yes to everything. Instead, I made the cost of every change visible. I set up a simple, lightweight process where any new request was written down, sized for its real impact on time and effort, and then taken to the sponsor with one honest question. If we add this, what comes out, or what date moves? I made the trade-off explicit every single time. Suddenly the requests slowed right down, because people were no longer adding things for free. They had to choose. Result. We delivered on the original date with the original core intact, plus the 2 changes that genuinely mattered, which the sponsor consciously chose to swap in. The dozen smaller requests that had seemed urgent in the moment quietly fell away once people saw what they actually cost. Reflections. The lesson I carry from that is simple. Scope creep is rarely caused by bad people making unreasonable demands. It is caused by changes appearing to be free. The moment you attach an honest price to every change, and you make the trade-off the sponsor's decision rather than your battle, the creep manages itself. You stop being the person who says no, and you become the person who shows the true cost. Notice what that answer did. It never made the candidate sound rigid, and it never made them sound like a pushover. It made them sound like someone who protects a deadline by giving other people honest choices rather than by fighting them. That is the move. You do not block change, you price it, and you hand the decision to the person who owns the budget. And here is your tease for what comes next. Once you have shown you can control a project that is growing, they almost always reach for the question candidates dread most. The one about failure. Let us walk straight into it. Chapter 2. Tell me about a project that failed. Your stomach just dropped a little, did it not? This is the question people lie awake over, and the instinct is to dodge it. To pick something tiny. To blame a supplier. To say, honestly, I have not really had one fail. As Oster, our test. Please do not do that. The moment you claim you have never had a project fail, one of 2 things happens in the interviewer's mind. Either you have not done enough to have scars, or you are not honest enough to admit them. Both are worse than the failure itself. What they are really testing is whether you can take responsibility without falling apart, and whether you learned something that made you better. Own it cleanly. That is the whole game. Here is how that sounds. Situation. A few years ago I was leading a program to replace an aging internal system that hundreds of staff used every day. The business case was strong and the appetite was high. Challenges. 2 things were working against us from the start, and I did not weight them properly. The first was that the people who used the old system every day were never genuinely consulted, only informed. The second was that the leadership sponsor changed twice in the first 6 months, and each new sponsor wanted to relitigate decisions we had already closed. Task. My responsibility was to deliver a working replacement within the financial year, and to keep the staff who relied on it confident through the transition. Action. Here is where I will be honest about my own part. I focused too hard on the technical build and not hard enough on the people. I assumed that because the new system was better, adoption would follow. When the resistance came, I tried to fix it late with training sessions that should have started months earlier. Result. We delivered the system, but adoption was poor for the first quarter. People kept finding workarounds to avoid it, and we lost time we should not have lost. By any honest measure, that phase was a failure, and I have never pretended otherwise. Reflections. It changed how I run every project since. Now, the people who will live with the thing I am building are in the room from week 1, not week 30. I treat adoption as part of the build, not an afterthought bolted on at the end. That single project taught me more than 5 smooth ones ever could. One more thing about choosing your failure story. Pick one that is genuinely over, with a clear ending, and a clear lesson. Do not pick a wound that is still open, where you are not yet sure what went wrong, because the interviewer will feel that uncertainty, and it will read as defensiveness. The best failure story is one you have already made peace with. You are not confessing, you are teaching them something you learned the hard way. Do you hear how that works? the failure is real. The ownership is total, but by the end, you sound like someone who is now safer to hire, not riskier. A failure you have clearly metabolized is an asset in an interview. A failure you are hiding is a liability. Next, they will want to know how you behave when a project is not failing outright, but is quietly slipping away from you. The slow motion problem, let us look at that. Chapter 3. Tell me about a time a project was running behind schedule. Every project manager has lived this one. The plan said one thing, reality said another, and somewhere in the middle, you had to make hard choices while everyone watched. The trap here is to tell a story where the delay was entirely outside your control and you heroically saved the day. It sounds impressive for about 10 seconds, and then it sounds like you do not take ownership of timelines at all. The better story is one where you saw the slip early, faced it squarely, and made a deliberate call about what to protect. Watch how the shape carries it. Situation. I was running a project to deliver a new customer-facing service, with a launch date that had already been announced publicly. So the deadline was not soft. It was a promise the organization had made out loud. Challenges. About halfway through, it became clear we were going to be roughly 3 weeks late if nothing changed. One of the technical components was far more complex than the early estimates suggested, and the team responsible was also being pulled onto urgent fixes elsewhere. Task. My job was to either protect the launch date or change it in a controlled way, and above all to make sure leadership heard the truth from me early, rather than discovering it late. Action. First, I did the thing that is uncomfortable, but essential. I told the sponsor we had a problem while there was still time to act on it. Then I sat down with the team and we separated the launch into what was genuinely essential for day one, and what could follow in a fast second release. We protected the core, we deferred the rest, and I renegotiated the scope of the launch rather than the date. Result: we launched on the promised date with a smaller but solid first version, and the deferred features followed within a month. The public promise was kept, and the team was not burned out by a death march to deliver things that could safely wait. Reflections. The lesson I carry from that is simple. A deadline and a scope are two levers, and most people only ever pull one. When time is fixed and real, scope is where you find your room. And the earlier you raise the problem, the more levers you still have to pull. That last line is worth keeping. The earlier you raise a problem, the more options you have left. Say something like that in an interview, and you sound like someone who has actually steered a project through trouble, not just read about it. Now, steering a project is not only about plans and dates. It is about people who do not agree with each other. So let us talk about conflict. Chapter 4. Tell me about a time you handled conflict in a team. Here is a small secret about this question. The interviewer is not really hoping for a dramatic story. They are slightly afraid of you. They want to know that if they hire you, you will not be the person who either avoids every difficult conversation, or detonates every disagreement into a war. So the worst answers go to one of two extremes. Either the conflict magically resolved itself because everyone was reasonable, which tells them nothing, or you crushed the opposition and proved you were right, which tells them you are exhausting to work with. The answer that wins sits in the middle. You took the heat out, you found the real issue under the surface noise, and you got people moving again. Here is the shape in action. Situation. On one project, two senior people, one from the technical side and one from the operational side, were locked in a standoff that was slowing everything down. Meetings had become tense, and people were starting to take sides. Challenges. The surface argument was about a technical approach, but underneath, it was not really about that at all. The operational lead felt that decisions were being made without her input. and the technical lead felt that every decision he made was being second-guessed by someone who did not understand the constraints. Task. My responsibility was to get the project moving again without picking a winner, because picking a winner would have poisoned the working relationship for the rest of the project. Action. I spoke to each of them separately first, not in the heated room. I asked them less about the technical argument and more about what they each needed to feel comfortable with the outcome. Then I brought them together with a narrow, clear question to solve, and I made sure the operational lead was genuinely consulted on the decision, not just told about it afterwards. I also named the real issue gently. I said out loud that this looked less like a disagreement about method, and more about wanting to be heard. Result. The standoff broke within a week. They did not become close friends, and they did not need to. But they started solving problems together again, and the project picked up its pace. Reflections. What that taught me is that most team conflict is not about the thing people are arguing over. It is about respect, or control, or feeling unheard. Solve the thing underneath and the surface argument usually dissolves on its own. Keep that idea close. The argument on the surface is rarely the real fight. A project manager who can hear the quiet thing under the loud thing is worth a great deal. Speaking of the quiet things, let us talk about the stakeholder who outranks you and disagrees with you. That is its own special kind of pressure. Chapter 5. Tell me about a time you managed a difficult stakeholder. This one separates the people who have only run small projects from the people who have run real ones. Because managing someone with more power than you, is one of the hardest things a project manager does. You cannot order them, you can only influence them. The mistake here is to tell a story where the difficult stakeholder was simply wrong, and you were simply right. Even if that was true, it makes you sound like you see senior people as obstacles. The better story is one where you understood why they were being difficult, and you worked with that rather than against it. Let me show you. Situation. I was delivering a project that depended on the cooperation of a senior leader who, frankly, did not want the project to happen. It threatened a way of working that his part of the organization had relied on for years. Challenges. He was not openly hostile, that would have been easier. Instead, he was politely unavailable. Meetings got postponed, decisions got deferred, and his team mirrored his lack of urgency. The project was being quietly starved rather than openly blocked. Task. My job was to get his genuine cooperation, not just his grudging compliance, because without his team engaged the project simply would not work. Action. I stopped trying to win him over with the project's benefits to the organization, because he did not care about those. Instead, I went to understand what he was actually worried about. It turned out he feared the change would make his most experienced people look obsolete, and he was protecting them. So I reframed the project around that. I showed him how his experienced people could become the experts in the new way of working, rather than its casualties. I gave him a stake in the outcome that served what he cared about. Result. He went from politely blocking to actively supporting, and his team's involvement was the thing that eventually made the project succeed. The very person who was the biggest risk became one of the strongest advocates. Reflections. The lesson is one I use constantly now. When someone with power is being difficult, they almost always have a reason that makes complete sense from where they are sitting. Find that reason. Solve for it. You will get far further than you ever will by being right. That is the heart of managing up. You do not overpower a senior stakeholder. You understand them so well that helping you becomes the thing that helps them too. Now let us shift from people to plans, because at some point every interviewer wants to know how you actually think about delivery. How you handle risk before it becomes a crisis. Chapter 6. Tell me about a time you identified and managed a major risk. Plenty of people can describe a disaster after it has happened. Far fewer can show that they saw it coming and quietly diffused it before it ever became a story worth telling. That is the difference this question is hunting for. Hindsight is cheap. Foresight is what they are paying for. The weak version of this answer is a risk that was obvious to everyone, where managing it just meant adding a line to a spreadsheet. The strong version is a risk you spotted that others had missed, and a specific action you took that changed the outcome. Here is how it sounds with the shape underneath it. Situation. I was leading a project that depended heavily on a single external supplier to deliver a critical component. Everything downstream waited on them. Challenges. On paper, the supplier looked fine. But early on I noticed small signals that worried me. Their responses were getting slower. The same key contact kept appearing on every call as though they were stretched thin, and a couple of minor deadlines had already slipped without much explanation. Nobody else was alarmed. The contract was signed and the dates were agreed. Task. My responsibility was to protect the project's timeline, which meant taking those weak signals seriously, even though raising them risked looking like I was creating a problem where none existed. Action. Rather than wait for proof, I treated the risk as real. I quietly built a contingency. I identified a second supplier who could step in if needed. And I restructured part of the plan so that the work depending on this component could be delayed by a few weeks without sinking everything else. I also had a direct, honest conversation with the original supplier about what I was seeing. Result. 2 months later, that supplier hit serious internal trouble and could not deliver on time. But because I had built the contingency early, we switched to the backup with only a minor delay instead of a catastrophic one. The project that should have been derailed barely wobbled. Reflections. What I took from that is to trust the small signals. Big failures rarely arrive without warning. They send little messages first, slower replies, a missed minor date, a nervous tone on a call. The project managers who survive are the ones who act on the whisper instead of waiting for the shout. Act on the whisper instead of waiting for the shout. If you remember one line from this whole chapter, make it that one. Next, let us talk about something less dramatic but just as important in interviews. How you lead a team that does not actually report to you. Chapter 7. Tell me about a time you led a team without formal authority. This is the reality of almost every project manager's life, and good interviewers know it. You are responsible for delivery, but the people doing the work usually report to someone else. You cannot promote them, you cannot discipline them, and you certainly cannot order them around. So how do you get a team to follow you when you hold no power over their careers? The poor answer leans on process. We had stand-ups, we had a board, we tracked tasks. That describes the furniture, not the leadership. The strong answer is about how you earned the team's commitment when you had nothing to compel it with. Here is the shape. Situation. I was brought in to deliver a project using a team drawn from 4 different departments, none of whom reported to me, and several of whom already had full workloads before I arrived. Challenges. At the start, I was just another demand on their time, and not an especially welcome one. A couple of them made it quietly clear they saw the project as an interruption to their real jobs. I had responsibility for the outcome but no lever to pull if they simply did not prioritize it. Task. My job was to turn a borrowed group of busy people into a team that actually wanted the project to succeed. Action. I did a few deliberate things. First, I spent the early weeks understanding what each person actually cared about, and where possible I connected the project to that. For one person, it was visibility with senior leaders, so I made sure her contribution was seen. For another, it was learning a new skill, so I steered that work his way. Second, I was ruthless about not wasting their time. Short meetings, clear asks, no busy work. I protected their time as if it were precious, because to them it was. And third, I took the blame publicly when things went wrong and gave them the credit publicly when things went right. Result: within about a month, the energy shifted. People started turning up to optional sessions. They began flagging problems early instead of hiding them. The team became genuinely committed. Not because I had power, but because being on the project had become worth their while. Reflections. The lesson has shaped how I lead ever since. Authority is the weakest tool a project manager has anyway. The strongest is making people genuinely want to do the work. Get that right, and you barely need authority at all. That is leadership without a stick. You make the work matter to each person, you guard their time, and you share the credit generously. Do that, and titles become almost irrelevant. Now, let us get into the harder edge of the role. The moment you have to deliver news nobody wants to hear. Chapter 8. Tell me about a time you had to deliver bad news to senior leadership. This question is quietly checking your spine. Can you walk into a room full of people more powerful than you and tell them something they will not like, clearly, and without flinching? Because a project manager who softens bad news until it is meaningless is genuinely dangerous to an organization. The mistake candidates make is to tell a story where the bad news turned out fine, so there was never any real risk in delivering it. The better story is one where the news was genuinely unwelcome. You delivered it straight, and you came with a plan rather than just a problem. Here is how it works. Situation. Partway through a major project, it became clear that the budget we had been given was not going to be enough. We were going to need a significant amount more to finish properly, and the original figure had been approved at the highest level. Challenges. The leadership team had already told their own bosses what this would cost. Going back to say we need more was not just awkward, it risked making senior people look bad to the people above them. That is the kind of news that gets messengers shot. Task. My responsibility was to tell them the truth in time for them to do something about it, and to do it in a way that gave them a path forward, rather than just a crisis to absorb. Action. I did not bury the number or dress it up. I led with it. I told them plainly that we needed roughly 20% more than the original budget, and why. But, and this is the crucial part, I did not arrive with only the problem. I came with 3 options. 1. Fund the gap and deliver the full scope. 2. Reduce the scope to fit the original budget. And I showed exactly what we would lose. 3. A middle path that funded part of the gap and deferred the rest. I made the choice theirs, but I made it an informed choice. Result. They were not happy, and I did not expect them to be. But because I had been straight with them and given them real options, the conversation was about deciding, not about blame. They chose the middle path, and we delivered. More than that, my standing with that leadership team went up, not down. Honesty delivered early, with options attached, builds trust rather than burning it. Reflections. What I learned is that leaders can handle bad news far better than most people assume. What they cannot handle is being surprised, or being handed a problem with no way through. Bring the news early, bring it straight, and bring options. Do that, and bad news becomes a moment of trust, rather than a moment of danger. That is the formula worth keeping. News early, news straight, options attached. It turns the worst conversations into the ones that build your reputation. Now let us look at how you handle the opposite pressure. Not too little, but too much. The project where everything is a priority. Chapter 9. Tell me about a time you had to manage competing priorities. Every project manager knows this squeeze. 3 things are all urgent, all important, and all wanted by someone who will be upset if theirs slips. The interviewer wants to know whether you have a way of thinking through that, or whether you just work longer hours and hope. The weak answer is I prioritized based on importance, which says nothing, because everyone says that. The strong answer shows your actual method, and shows that you were willing to disappoint someone deliberately, rather than do everything badly. Here is the shape. Situation. At one point I was effectively running 3 work streams inside a single program, and they all reached a crunch in the same fortnight. Each had a stakeholder who considered theirs the most important thing happening. Challenges. There was genuinely not enough capacity to do all 3 well at the same time. Something had to give, and every option meant telling somebody influential that their priority was going to wait. Task. My job was to make a clear, defensible call about sequence, and then to hold that line when the pressure came, rather than quietly trying to do everything and doing all of it half well. Action. I did not make the decision in my own head and announce it. I made the criteria visible. I sat the stakeholders down together and we agreed, openly, what mattered most to the organization right now. Not to each of them, to the organization. We looked at which delay caused the most damage, which deadline was externally fixed, and which work unblocked the most other work. Once those criteria were on the table, the right order became almost obvious, and crucially, it was a shared decision rather than my decree. Then I was honest with the person whose work came last, about exactly when they could expect it. Result: we delivered all 3 properly, just in sequence rather than all at once. And because the prioritization had been done openly against shared criteria, the person who had to wait did not feel sidelined. They had been part of the decision. Reflections. The lesson is that prioritization is not really a scheduling problem. It is a trust problem. People can accept going last if they understand the reasoning, and they were part of setting it. What they cannot accept is being quietly deprioritized in the dark. Make the criteria visible and most of the conflict disappears. There is a small phrase I use in these moments that takes the heat out of the room. I tell the stakeholders, we are not deciding whose work matters, we are only deciding the order. Everything gets done. That one reframe turns a fight over importance into a calm conversation about sequence, and it is far easier to win agreement on sequence than on whose project is most precious. Make the criteria visible. That is how you turn an impossible squeeze into a decision people can live with, even the people who lose. Now we come to the last question, and it is the one that quietly matters most of all. The one about what you have actually learned. Chapter 10. What is the most important lesson your career has taught you? This question feels gentle, almost like the interview is winding down. Do not relax. This is often the answer they remember longest, because it tells them who you really are when the structured questions are over. It is your chance to leave one clear idea in their minds as they decide. The mistake is to reach for something grand and hollow. A lesson so big it means nothing. The power comes from choosing one specific, hard-won truth and saying it plainly. Here is the shape, one last time. Situation. Early in my career, I believed that a project succeeded or failed on the quality of its plan. I was proud of my plans. They were detailed, they were thorough, and I defended them fiercely. Challenges. The problem was that reality kept refusing to follow my beautiful plans. Suppliers slipped, priorities shifted, people left, and budgets moved. And every time reality diverged from the plan, I treated it as reality being wrong, rather than my plan being out of date. Task. At some point I had to confront a simple question. Was my job to produce a perfect plan, or to deliver a result in a world that would not sit still? Action. I changed how I worked. I stopped treating the plan as a promise, and started treating it as a best current guess that I expected to revise. I built in room for the unexpected rather than pretending it would not come. I spent less energy defending the plan and more energy reading the early signs that it needed to change. And I learned to bring people with me through those changes rather than springing them. Result: my projects got more reliable, not less, even though my plans became less rigid. The flexibility was the strength. I stopped being surprised by the world, because I had stopped expecting it to behave. Reflections. So if you ask me the most important lesson, it is this. A plan is not a prediction. It is a tool for thinking, and its job is to change as you learn. The best project managers I know hold their plans loosely and their goals tightly. That one shift, from defending the plan to serving the goal, changed everything for me. And if you want to land this answer perfectly in an interview, end it the way I just did, with the lesson stated as a single clear sentence they could repeat to a colleague afterwards. Hold your plans loosely and your goals tightly. Give them one line they can carry out of the room. That is what gets remembered when the panel sits down to compare notes about who they liked. And there it is, 10 questions, one shape, and a way through every one of them. Let me leave you with 3 things to do before your next interview, while all this is still fresh. First, take 3 real projects from your own career and write each one out using the 6 beats. Situation, challenges, task, action, result, reflections. Just write them down. The act of writing forces the structure into your memory, so that under pressure the shape is already there waiting for you. Second, find your failure story now, before anyone asks for it. Pick a real project that went wrong. Decide exactly how you will own it, and decide what it taught you. Never let the failure question catch you unprepared again. Walk in already knowing your answer. Third, practice saying your answers out loud, not in your head. In your head, every answer sounds fluent. Out loud is where you find the rambling, the gaps, the moment you run out of road. Say each one to the wall, to a friend, to your own phone recording. The first time you hear yourself is the moment the answer actually starts to improve. Do those 3 things and you will walk into that room as the calm one. The one who has clearly done the work. The one they remember for the right reasons. If this helped, follow the channel for more. Because the next interview you walk into could be the one that changes everything, and I would like you to be ready for it.